Good evening. I'm Eric Lee, Director of the Kimball Art Museum. Thank you for joining us this evening as we mark the final weeks of the stunning exhibition, Murillo, From Heaven to Earth. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Adam Jasinski. Adam is currently Associate Professor of Art History at Southern Methodist University. He joined the SMU faculty in 2016, having earned his BA and PhD degrees from Harvard University. Adam specializes in the art of the early modern Hispanic world and works closely with the collections of the Meadows Museum, frequently teaching in its galleries. Additionally, he is a 2022-23 Marilyn Tomà Fellow in the Arts of the Spanish Americas. His well-published research has been supported by numerous postdoctoral grants. Among other honors, in 2021, he was awarded the Arthur Kingsley Porter Prize by the College Art Association for the best article of the year by a young scholar. Adam has just returned from a semester in Italy at the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies at Villa I Tatti near Florence, where he has been researching a new project that investigates disgust, affect, and early modern Catholic image making. And we'll tune in later to learn more about that intriguing topic. In a few weeks, he heads to Spain, where he will be in residence as a fellow at the Madrid Institute for Advanced Study. His book, Praying to Portraits, Audience, Identity, and the Inquisition in the Early Modern Hispanic World, is coming out in May of this year. Congratulations on this book, Adam, and welcome to the podium.
All right. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right at this volume? Great. I decided that I would not hitch myself to the podium. I'm going to be wandering the stage. Hopefully I don't end up on the floor. I also realized I should have worn less clicky shoes tonight, but hopefully it's not too distracting to you. Thank you so much for the generous introduction, Eric. Thank you for the invitation to be here tonight at the Kimball, and thank you also to Nancy Edwards and Rebecca Goss for helping organize this lecture tonight. I'm going to be speaking tonight to you about one painting from the exhibition next door upstairs. It's the one that anchors that spectacular gallery of portraits. Although, as you'll realize quite quickly, I'll be sort of talking around the painting quite a bit. Eric, you mentioned the title of my book that's forthcoming, Praying to Portraits. And so the interest I have tonight is in talking about the category of sacred portraiture, a term that may seem paradoxical or contradictory. After all, we think of portraits as secular images, whereas sacred images serve for prayer, serve for devotion. How could it be that there is something between them? Well, this painting fits neatly into that sort of gray area between them. So tonight, my talk is divided into 4 sections. The first, I'll ask us to think about what a portrait was in 1600 in the early modern Hispanic world. Then I'll think about the category of sacred portraits, what I just mentioned, talking in particular about 2 case studies from the book. Then we'll get to King Ferdinand, or Saint Ferdinand, the subject of the Murillo portrait that I just showed you. And we'll look at 4 different testimonies from the extensive and very serious legal proceedings that led to the saint's canonization. And finally, the celebrations for Saint Ferdinand. And you'll see that I put saint in quotation marks, and we'll look at what it meant for a canonization to actually be completed. As we'll see, Saint Ferdinand, through perhaps ecclesiastical, clerical error, maybe oversight, never actually became formally a saint. So to begin, what was a portrait in 1600? Now, this may seem like a deceptively simple question. An image like this, I think, to all of us would register as a type of image that we would call a portrait. It's a representation of a specific individual, even an individual whom we feel like we might recognize. There are certain facial features that he has, the crow's feet around his eyes, the slightly protruding jaw, the graying hair that make us feel like this is a real person. And indeed, this is a portrait posthumously painted, but after earlier examples of the emperor and king Charles I or V, painted by the court painter Juan Pantoja de la Cruz. This is a kind of image that fulfilled certain specific functions. It was commemorative. It was about remembrance. It was about teaching virtues. And sure enough, this wonderful print in a publication from 1622 shows us how such a portrait would have been used. It was a mirror of virtues for the young prince who was meant to look upon this portrait of his ancestor and reflect on what had made him such a great leader, such a great person, right? So this is what portraits in the traditional sense are about. But portraits could be more sort of stranger types of images than we are accustomed to. Here we have a painting of the famed Miraculous icon, the Our Lady of the Helpless, which was a particularly famous advocation from the city of Valencia. And if you look at this detail here, the text tells us this is a true portrait of Our Lady of the Helpless of Valencia. So the painting itself announces that it is a portrait, and not just any portrait, but a true one, right? We get the sense that portraits could also be representations of objects. They didn't necessarily have to be representations of people. Portraits could be depictions of particular places. This spectacular print depicting the main square of the city of Madrid also tells us what it is, a true portrait of the sumptuous building of the square of the very noble town of Madrid. So it is or at least we're told, it's a seemingly accurate representation of a real place. This wonderful image from the realm of natural history, the true portrait of the she-ant bear, or anteater, announces in the very first words of the lengthy description that this is a true portrait. And for people in Madrid who may have never seen a she-ant bear, they were thereby told that they should believe that there existed such a creature with this funny snout and long, long tongue. And the description goes on to explain what these features served it for. And finally, we are told here that this too, this horrible wild animal, which was allegedly spotted on the outskirts of the city of Jerusalem in 1788, is also here represented accurately as it exists in real life. Now, we have to decide for ourselves whether that is accurate. There were two conditions for something to be a portrait, according to Francisco Pacheco. Pacheco was an art theorist. He was perhaps best known, although unfairly, as the father-in-law of the painter Diego Velázquez, and he was also a painter in his own right. And he wrote, for an image to be a portrait, it has to have two conditions. These are, or the first, I'll read from this screen. The first is that the portrait has to be very similar to the original. And the second obligation is that it be well drawn and painted. But if either likeness or good quality are to be missing, then let likeness remain, since this is the goal of portraiture. So this gives us a little bit of a sense of why this wide plethora of types of images can all fit under the rubric of the portrait. As long as there is some sort of real-world prototype for the image, then if the image represents that prototype accurately, that image is a portrait. Although, again, we have to wonder whether this horrible wild animal actually existed in the world. In any case, as viewers of these images, we're meant to believe that it did. So we see that our definition of portraiture is much narrower than the definition of portraiture that someone in the 17th century would have had. And sure enough, there's another type that I haven't yet discussed, which is the sacred portrait. Sacred images, too, were readily classified as portraits because they were believed to have real and true prototypes that existed in the world and that these representations somehow captured. These types of images had a lengthy and very prestigious pedigree. They went back to images such as this one, known as the Holy Face or the Veil of Veronica, which were believed to be authoritative likenesses of holy figures, in particular of Christ in this case, which were then taken as proof that God wished for Christians to use images. After all, he would not have left images of his son, Christ, for people to worship, to adore, if he did not wish Catholics or Christians to use images. And this became a really important point, as you can imagine, during the Protestant Reformation, when various groups decided that image worship was anathema to what Christian practice was. These kinds of images essentially expanded in the early modern period, in the late medieval, early modern period. For instance, not only was Christ believed to have authoritative portraits, but the Virgin as well. In the Kingdom of Valencia, you had the cult of the so-called Veronica of the Virgin, believed to be an authoritative portrait of the Mother of Christ. And there were also well-known stories about the apparition of the Virgin to Saint Luke, who then was depicted in the process of portraying her. And you can see this wonderful representation here where Luke, the artist, is represented in the action of painting the Virgin. And that's one of the reasons why Luke was then considered the patron saint of artists. Quickly, with these kind of authoritative models, religious orders, patrons decided that it was important to begin representing saints. So not just the highest echelon of holy figures, but potentially new figures in the Christian, let's say, encyclopedia of holy figures with the same kind of portraitistic accuracy that they had come to expect. One of the first saints who is consistently represented with a portraitistic attention to specific idiosyncratic facial features is Saint Bernardino of Siena. Now, although these two images differ slightly, we perhaps struggle to identify the same figure within them, we can see that they do share certain characteristics, right? The slightly drooping, downturned mouth, the shape of the receding hairline. These are qualities that were deemed to be important because it was believed that something of Bernardino's virtues, something of his inner qualities was also reflected in the form that his physiognomy, that his physical features took. And it was important, therefore, for the entire corpus of representations of Saint Bernardino to adhere to his portrait, to be recognizable not just through attributes, right? So for instance, always representing Saint Catherine with a wheel or representing Saint Margaret with a dragon. That wasn't enough. In this case, patrons and artists wanted to ensure that the saint would be recognizable through their face as a portrait. And this became very, very important in all of the cults of the so-called modern saints. That is to say, saints who had died in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries who may have been remembered by specific individuals and who became canonized by the Catholic Church. So best examples of these kinds of portraitistic or portrait-centric cults are Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, and Teresa of Avila, the reformer of the Discalced Carmelites, both of whom here are represented in very portraitistic ways and who were consistently represented according to a specific set of recognizable features. In terms of Ignatius, for instance, what's interesting is that he allegedly refused to be portrayed while he was alive, but his followers took a plaster cast of his face when he died, and they made multiple copies of that plaster cast and sent it around to every Jesuit college to serve as the basis for representation. So really there's this intense interest in indexical, precise, accurate representation. What about such an image such as this one? We would probably think of this as a quite standard portrait, quite a beautiful portrait actually. It's a representation of the patriarch of the city of Valencia, and this is what it looked like when it was first painted. But this is what it looks like today. At some point, following the canonization of Juan de Ribera, which occurred, of course, long after his death, someone said, well, we have to adjust this existing portrait to show that he has become a saint. So the image, in some ways, is following the life history of the person that it represents. And that's another interesting thing about sacred portraits, that they adapt to circumstances and they register that a portrait can become an image for devotion, for prayer. It's a very different kind of image than the simple portraits that we started with. What do you do, though, when the person who you need to portray is long dead? What about ancient saints? How do you ensure that you represent them with the same degree of detail, of specificity, as these modern saints who have entire cults built around portraits? Well, this was absolutely something that people began to be very concerned about. In the project of filling the Basilica of El Escorial outside of Madrid with paintings of saints, the contract that the painter had to fulfill, Juan Fernandez Navarrete, was that he would track down portraits if they existed. The contract says, should one of the saints have a portrait from life, their painting shall be painted in conformity with that portrait, which shall be sought out with diligence wherever it may be. So even if a saint is not necessarily known through a large corpus of portraits, if there's any evidence that there may be somewhere a portrait of St. Thomas, St. Bartholomew, an ancient saint, the painter agrees to track that portrait down and paint these new representations with maximum adherence to that model, right? There's a major interest in addressing what the art historian from Harvard, Felipe Pereda, has called the desperate search for certainty in early modern Hispanic spirituality, right? And I love that concept, the desperate search for certainty, because I think so many of these cases so clearly demonstrate that kind of bubbling anxiety of how do we know? How can we make sure that what we are venerating is true? Pacheco, once again, we love Pacheco, he tells us so much, writes that when there exists a true portrait of a given saint that has been made in death or from life or in some way, or when the features of their face are known through history or through the information of someone who knew them, it must be given more credit than to a portrait made by the imagination. And therefore, it's a great consolation to follow the many portraits of the saints of our days that are venerated. In this last line, he's specifically pointing to the saints of our days, these modern saints who have entire sort of cults built around what their faces looked like. And he says that these are more important, more valuable than images made from the imagination, right? So he's saying artists should not be inventing in this case. These images are so important because they fulfill such crucial functions for spirituality that they should not be drawn from the imagination. Whoever sees them, he writes, should feel that they are seeing a true portrait. The category of sacred portraits was even broader than that, and actually includes many types that sometimes leave us pondering how it is possible that such images even exist. This is perhaps my favorite example, a portrait of Queen Margherita of Austria and her daughter, the Infanta Anna, as the Virgin receiving the angel of the Annunciation. This is a portrait that the Queen displayed or held in her private oratory that she feasibly prayed to. And of course, this too fits within this larger category of sacred portraiture. Images such as this one, which to our eyes, you can see that it's quite a damaged painting, but nonetheless quite beautiful. Clearly a portrait of a young man, probably painted sometime around the 1620s or 30s. But someone later has gone in and added these quite clumsy letters that retitle the image. And what they read is San Felipe Neri, Saint Philip Neri, the Italian saint canonized in 1622. What I suspect happened here is different than what we saw with San Juan de Ribera or Saint Juan de Ribera. Here, I think probably the identity of the sitter was lost. And all of a sudden, people realized they had this painting that was entirely meaningless. After all, what is a portrait if no one remembers who is represented? And so a great way to fill that image with meaning, once again, was to retitle it, to say, well, we might as well think of this image as an image of a saint. Finally, the third example I want to show, to showing this sort of expanded category of sacred portraits, is this one. In formal terms, this looks very much like court portraits of the early to mid 17th century in Spain. And actually, we know who this figure is through comparison with other representations. This is Juan José de Austria, an illegitimate son of the king. Interestingly, though, at the bottom corner, a line of text once again tells us that this image is more than meets the eye. It says Saint Hermenegild, unfortunately no longer in the top 10 most popular children's names, but nevertheless at the time a crucially important saint. Philip III's middle name was Hermenegild, so this was a crucial saint who was important to the dynasty because he was a royal saint. What was this image? Was it intended as a portrait of the young prince as a saint, as that portrait of the queen, as the Virgin we had seen? Was it repainted at a later date? We simply, without technical analysis, don't know. But it speaks to this larger, the complexity of this larger category of sacred portraiture where images seem to fit different types at different moments, right? And so what I want to stress precisely is that this gray area between these seemingly monolithic categories of the secular portrait and of the religious image is actually filled with these kind of oftentimes confounding examples that force us to rethink these sort of ossified, very standardized categories. All right, so we now get to the main painting, the star of the show, King Ferdinand. And first I lied. I was looking. See, I lied. I'm sorry. I thought we were here, and we're actually here. Demonic authorities. But I promise this one is fun. So let's backtrack. What I was saying is that people want certainty in the figures that they're praying to, right? How, though, do you ensure that the figure you are praying to, that the representation of the saint you are praying to is accurate? Well, it's hard to confirm, especially if the saint has been long dead. The case that I'm going to briefly outline, my favorite from the entire book, is a one that occurs in the late 1620s and early 1630s in the convent of San Placido in Madrid. I show you here the later altarpiece in the church. This is a Benedictine community of nuns. If you're in Madrid, it's absolutely worth visiting. What happens there is quite a well-known case of demonic possession. Inquisitors find out that the entire community of nuns are said to be possessed by demons. What's interesting from the point of view of the art historian, though, is that the demons do a lot of unusual things. Of course, they do all the regular things that a possessed person does, speaking in tongues and so on and so forth, but they also appear to be very interested in art. They commission paintings, they evaluate existing paintings, and they really tell us a lot about how people thought about images in 17th century Madrid at this time. So I'm going to read you a few passages from this fascinating case. The important figure here is the nun's confessor, Francisco Garcia Calderón. In the house of that painter, the one who was commissioned, there ought to be other pictures that were made based on the instructions that he, this witness, Juan de Barahona, had given to the painter. These were a portrait of Christ and of the glorious Saint Benedict and of Saint Scholastica, all of these following what the prior had recorded from the possessed nuns. So the prior is going around talking to these nuns who are apparently possessed and recording the kinds of images that the demons want the painter to make. Seems to be counterintuitive that demons would be really interested in Catholic painting, but there you go. They're very interested in it. The inquisitors are concerned, not because of the obvious reasons that these women are possessed. What they really want to establish is whether the demons are sharing this knowledge in good faith. As it turns out, demons, it's believed, can share true divine knowledge. Usually, though, they choose to pervert that knowledge, and so this is one of the cruxes of this inquisitorial case. What we read next is that when the prior was shown an existing painting of the glorious patriarch Saint Benedict, he, in his typically obscure and florid words, made clear that he had seen the saint himself. Upon seeing the portrait, he declared, "It is he." In this case, what's happening is the prior is claiming to have access to supernatural or divine knowledge and using that knowledge to evaluate existing paintings in the collection of the convent. In this case, he's saying, yes, this painting of the long-deceased medieval Saint Benedict is accurate. It's actually a true portrait. And he's declaring this by using demonic knowledge. So he's using a source, a supernatural source, to bolster the claim that this is truly a true portrait. I find it hard to find a more explicit example of this desperate search for certainty. After all, if you're willing to turn to demons for your support, it means you're pretty desperate. And finally, this is perhaps the most interesting case, it was publicly known that the demon of Sister Anastasia described the features and face of the glorious Saint Benedict, and that the prior had a painter make drawings and bring them to said nun. He asked whether any of them were in accordance with the face of the saint, to which the demon responded that they were not. In this case, there's one drawing associated with this trial. It's a very humble thing, I think probably made by a notary who is recording the experience of having had this drawing brought in as evidence. And there's this wonderful detail of the nail that's hammered into the wall and the little hook from which the picture hangs. This is one of these drawings that the demons allegedly said were not accurate enough. But it's this fascinating example, this one trace from this very complex trial about someone evaluating the truth of a holy image, right? Of course, the trial goes on after this for many, many years. The nuns and the prior are all imprisoned, and the scandal actually grows because it turns out that many of the people associated with the convent have close ties to the royal family. So it's a fascinating case that I recommend you to read on. There's quite a bit of literature about it. But from our point of view about the sort of complexity of this category of sacred portraiture, we see just how troubling, how problematic this category could be. Again, how do you prove with certainty the truth of what you are praying to? All right, we now get to St. Ferdinand, with apologies that I jumped the gun, so to speak. So the painting we're looking at tonight depicts a real person. The portrait looks like someone we could feasibly run into. There has not been much attention paid to smoothing out those features. There's, once again, slight crow's eyes, a slightly droopy cheek, almost like a 5 o'clock shadow on this person. This looks like a real individual. It's a militant individual, moreover. He's holding up his sword. It's no accident. It's a reminder of the incredibly complicated religious history in Spain leading up to this moment. The text at the bottom describes Saint Ferdinand as someone who had cleared Seville of what was deemed by the Catholic authorities to be the greatest threat, that is to say, the presence of Islam. And indeed, in the 13th century, Saint Ferdinand had led Christian troops that conquered the city of Ishbilia, that later became known as Seville. The context, though, in the period that we're looking at, the 16th and 17th centuries, continues to be one of religious conflict, even paranoia. And we've talked about the Inquisition. Many, many cases of the Inquisition focus on the persecution of people believed to be Jews or Muslims. So this is the context within which these kinds of images are functioning. Now, the trial itself is rich, complicated, and as serious as any civic or criminal lawsuit at the time, maybe even more extensive. The city of Seville, in particular its cathedral chapter, decides to submit a corpus of documentation to the papacy, to the Vatican, asking that Saint Ferdinand be officially declared a saint of the universal church. There are a couple ways to do this in the 17th century. What's certain is that it's an incredibly formalized process, and one that requires the work of multiple lawyers, advocates, people who present the case, people who collect information. Multiple witnesses are involved. It's a big deal. They begin the process in 1628, but it's not until 1671 that the cult is officially recognized. So the first stages involve a number of, you could say, let's say interesting work by witnesses. The first of whom I want to talk about is a doctor, the doctor who examined the exhumed body of the medieval king when his coffin was brought up from under the floor of Seville Cathedral. And I'll read to you his testimony and what he writes about the body. He says that given as a judge, he saw very carefully and attentively the body of the holy King Ferdinand that was shown to him. And what he finds is that the face retains its skin, the eyes retain their lids, his nose is preserved, his teeth white and strong. The entire face is, in his opinion, such that who knew him before would, seeing him now, be able to recognize him. Of course, this is the sentence I'm particularly interested in. It reminds me so much of that declaration by the prior of the monastery of San Placido, "This is he," right? This idea that this figure is still recognizable based on his facial features. And sure enough, there are very specific, detailed descriptions of what he looks like. There are drawings made. And so we can imagine that the painting we have by Murillo upstairs, in some ways, is aiming to build on that corpus of information to create, once again, as accurate a representation of the future saint as possible. Doctor then adds that this is particularly significant because the earth of Seville is so humid and lends itself to decay. Seeing the body so well preserved in the state that it is in, he, the doctor, considers this a miraculous thing, particularly given that more than 370 years had passed since his death. So not only do we have accuracy, we have our first miracle. And miracles are also important for the canonization proceedings of any given figure, even today. Therefore, we have the first miracle. Who speaks next? Well, the next one is our friend Francisco Pacheco. Now, I'm quite proud that when I was working on the materials of this case in the Vatican Secret Archive, I found this previously unknown testimony that, as you'll hopefully agree with me, is quite interesting. And so here's what we read from Pacheco's testimony. Pacheco tells us that he knows and has heard that King Ferdinand does many marvelous deeds, and especially when it comes to finding lost or stolen things. And that the following thing happened to him. He had a book of portraits of illustrious men on which he himself had worked for more than 30 years, and which he valued at 1,000 ducats. This book, along with many other books and papers, was stolen. He was particularly pained by this loss, which was very great, and all of his friends consoled him. One friend suggested that he pay for a mass to be said to the Holy King Ferdinand, and this witness, Pacheco, gave alms that such a mass be said, which was then performed in front of the saintly king's tomb. Good news, and our second miracle. This is what happens. It so happens that the same youth who had stolen the book took it to sell to at court, and offered it to the daughter of this witness, who lives in Madrid, whose name is Juana Pacheco, and who's married to Diego Velázquez, painter and chamber deputy of His Majesty the King. They recognized the book belonged to their father and notified him of the find. The book was composed of loose sheets and loose portraits and drawings, each one of which could have been sold on their own, but it was returned to him with not even a single page missing or damaged, and many people heard the news of this miraculous event. As it happens, we know exactly what book this is. It's one of the masterpieces of 17th century art, the so-called Book of Portraits of Francisco Pacheco, which is still preserved today in the library of the Lázaro Galdiano Museum in Madrid. And it's filled with these exquisite pen and ink drawings by Pacheco of so-called illustrious men of Seville. This passage is quite interesting for a number of reasons, not only because it tells us, or in some ways resolves many of the disputes about the early history of this object, that it was composed of loose drawings rather than bound, that how much Pacheco himself valued it at. It's also sort of amusing that he uses this opportunity to drop the name of his son-in-law, Diego Velázquez, the author of the wonderful painting upstairs by Pedro de Barberana, and just subtly mention that he is the painter to the king. But what's crucial for our purposes here is that it represents another confirmed miracle caused by Saint Ferdinand. So another bit of good news for the proceedings. The third bit of evidence I want to show, it comes from a merchant named Diego Fernandez. And Fernandez talks about a specific kind of image, and I'll start reading for you now. Fernandez was a merchant of book and prints, and he displayed in the chamber 2 sheets of printed images. And he declared that these prints were usually printed in Flanders, and that this witness had them and sold them, and that they always arrived depicting Holy King Saint Ferdinand with a halo, and in the form that can be seen. And because all these figures are saintly patrons of this city, they have been included here together. So we have here this quite lovely but simple print depicting various holy figures associated with the city of Seville. We have Saint Hermenegild, we're familiar with him now, and Saint Isidore and Leander, brothers who were bishops of Seville. All 3 of them are actually depicted here together in this marvelous painting by Francisco de Herrera the Elder. They're represented in a standardized way. They have halos. We recognize that these are saints, and of course, we're told that at the bottom in the little caption. Additionally, there are images of 2 important cults of the Virgin Mary, the cults of Guadalupe, interestingly not the one that we're familiar with here in just south of us in Mexico City, but the one in Extremadura in Spain, and the Virgin of the Kings, as they're known, both of which continue to be important devotional cults in Spain today. And finally, we have Ferdinand. Ferdinand included here much in the same way as Hermenegild. They are both crowned with halos, a standardized depiction of a saint. Although there is a small difference, Ferdinand is described as Don Fernando, or our Lord, Ferdinand III, Holy King, while Hermenegild is explicitly titled a saint. So there is still some attention that they have a different status, but from the point of view of the tribunal and of the witness who's presenting it, the point is that in popular veneration, Ferdinand is already recognized as a saint. So even though he doesn't have that official legal recognition from the point of view of the church, the people of Seville believe already that he is a saint. Interestingly, and I love these little details in a page like this, I just want to show you three more, which speak to the sort of legal aspect of this. So you can just see here the difference in paper. The print is actually pasted into this larger group as evidence, into this larger book of pages as evidence of the trial. You have the two different paginations. It means that at some point someone has been reorganizing these pages within this larger legal proceedings. You have the stamp of the Vatican Archive, that's later, but you also have this, the signature of the notary who has made sure, once this has been inserted, that this has been legally confirmed as crucial part of the evidence of the case for the canonization of San Fernando. Finally, our last bit of testimony, that by Murillo himself. What's important is that for a while after that initial submission of all that paperwork, all those testimonies and miracles in the trial, the case stalls. Nothing happens with it for a few decades. And it's not until the 1650s and 60s when there's a new impetus to try to move the case forward. One of the ways in which they decide to do that is by, once again, stressing the popular veneration that surrounds the figure of Ferdinand in the city of Seville. How do they do that? They decide to focus on existing images that can be found throughout the city. What they need to prove, though, is that those images are more than 100 years old, which would demonstrate that the cult, even if not official, is very firmly rooted in the city of Seville. So we begin with Murillo's first testimony, where he describes this print that can be found widely in print shops around the city. As regards the first image, which is a copper plate engraving of King Ferdinand known as the Saint, he, Murillo, said and declared that this print and the painting made after it, which has rays and a halo like a saint, is a modern painting. No good. Doesn't do anything for the case. He goes on. In this case, actually, it's Lopez who's an older painter, and they're going around together. Lopez declares, as regards the second painting which was visited that day, he said and declared that he is more than 54 years old, and that he remembers having seen that portrait for more than 40 years, and that based on his honest knowledge and understanding, it seems to him that the painting should be dated to more than 40 or 50 years before this witness had come to know it. So if he remembers it for 40 years and he thinks that it had already existed for 40 years, we're at 80 years. Close, but no cigar. Murillo keeps going. He says, what about this? As for the image of King Ferdinand the Saint in the Chapel of the Kings, he said and declared that it seemed to him that that effigy and portrait is more than 90 years old, because he knows by his experience in this art that the paintings are very ancient and without a doubt as old as he declares, and even older. All right, we're close. 90 years, not bad. Perhaps even more. What I find particularly fascinating here, is what Murillo says about his own expertise. He says that he, as a painter, has an awareness that the image looks different than the way one paints today. So he's already using an art historical knowledge, actually, in order to date the image. But finally, and his declaration comes about this painting, which we now know is from the early 16th century. He said and declared, based on many indicators in the painting, that he knows that the manner of painting the clothing from the time of the Visigoths with those golden fringes makes it a painting of more than 200 years of age. Now, he was a bit off. It's probably more like 150 years at that time. But what mattered here was that they had found an ancient painting that depicted Ferdinand as a saint. This was the proof they needed to show that there was existing veneration of this figure as a saint in the city of Seville. It's fascinating to see how Murillo is called upon to use his knowledge of the development of painting, the transformation of style across time, as evidence of the duration of this cult in the city of Seville. And so it's interesting also, I think, to think of Murillo as someone who's deeply knowledgeable of the artistic traditions of his city, and to see him as someone whose knowledge is valued, his expertise is valued. So in addition to being a marvelous painter in his own right, he is seen as an expert in the history of painting. All right, so the final section on the celebrations for Saint Ferdinand. So before we get started, I want to make very clear that a number of scholars have realized in past years, although really going back to the 18th century, people in Seville realized that not everything had been completely closed in this case. What we find out is that what happens in 1671 is the extension of the cult of Ferdinand to the territories of the Hispanic monarchy. What that means is that the cult, that means that essentially Ferdinand can be celebrated across 4 continents. But according to scholars, at no point is Ferdinand inserted into what's called the universal catalog of saints, or at no point is his cult made universal, which is the ultimate final degree of confirmation that makes someone a saint. What scholars also consistently stress is that even if there is this small lapse in, let's call it, ecclesiastical law, for all intents and purposes, Ferdinand is a saint. He has been treated as a saint, and he continues to be venerated as a saint, even though his cult is never inserted into the universal catalog. That's a small thing, and nevertheless I thought it important to stress. However, in 1671, when news arrives in Seville that the cult of Saint Ferdinand has been extended to the entire territory of the Spanish monarchy, the celebrations are immense. Murillo is close friends with 2 of the most important ecclesiastics in Seville at that time, and of course it makes sense, therefore, that he is tapped by those figures to create some of the most important images related to the celebrations of this monumental event, the elevation of Saint Ferdinand onto the altars, as it's said. The painting that is upstairs is one of these. There's another slightly different version or depiction of Saint Ferdinand in the Cathedral of Seville, although they undoubtedly share certain formal similarities. The painting that came from Auckland, it serves as the basis for a print by Matias de Arteaga, which is widely disseminated, and the basis for many, many later representations of the saint. The print is included initially in this book, the Fiestas de la Santa Iglesia Metropolitana, the festivities of the Holy Church of Seville, which is really a sort of showpiece of spectacular engravings, including this beautiful print of the bell tower of Seville, the Giralda, festooned in draperies and banners streaming in order to celebrate the Holy King, as well as this monumental temporary altarpiece that was erected in the central nave of the Cathedral of Seville, filled with allegorical figures, filled with various inscriptions, and at the very top is, of course, the Holy King himself holding up his crown towards the heavens. The city of Seville was not the only one that was happy. Most Holy Father, writes Queen Mariana of Austria to the Pope, I did not wish to cease expressing the singular joy that this news and benevolence has caused me. Indeed, I consider it a personal benevolence for the particular reasons that interest me in it. Now, what were these reasons? Well, St. Hermenegild's cult really never took off much. But for the first time, the Spanish Habsburgs could demonstrate, could show that they now had a saint in the family. In a letter written to King Charles II on the occasion of the opening of the Royal Hospice of St. Ferdinand in Madrid. This is the spectacular Baroque facade of that building. The administrator writes, "No one other than your Majesty is more justly the recipient of the dignity and worship of St. Ferdinand, being a holy king and a grandfather of your Majesty." Of course, he was a little bit more than a grandfather, a little more distant, but nevertheless, for the Spanish monarchy, for the first time, they had someone who could compete with Saint Louis, the patron saint of the French dynasty and the great rivals of the Spanish Habsburgs in the global political arena. For the first time, Saint Ferdinand was touted as the great success of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. So it was a big deal, not just for Seville, but for the monarchy as a whole. Sure enough, soon after, we have this very unusual portrait, actually a portrait that was what started me on my dissertation many years ago and eventually culminated in a book, a representation of King Charles II of Spain as Saint Ferdinand, entering into that long trajectory that we saw with the portrait of the Queen as the Virgin, with the portrait of the young Princess Saint Hermenegild. Here we have a representation of the King of Spain in the guise of that saintly grandfather of his Saint Ferdinand, and you can clearly recognize that iconography. So we've seen, in conclusion, that the painting that is perhaps seemingly deceptively simple stands at the head of a very long, complicated process of trying to reach the status of sanctity for this most cherished, most beloved founding figure of the city of Seville as a Christian city. And it also stands at in the sort of conjunction of this very complicated category of portraiture and sacred portraiture more generally that I've tried to outline here tonight. The painting really, I think, is at the intersection of multiple competing demands, and it can be read through its connection to all of these different kinds of very complicated image types. The painting tries to answer this question: what did Saint Ferdinand look like? How do I know that this most beloved figure is really what I'm told he looked like, right? It makes the claims of being an authoritative, legitimate, true portrait of this monarch. More generally, I think that the category of true portraiture, as we've seen, reminds us that any portrait at any time can come to function as a sacred image. This category was flexible, was complicated. And the image of Saint Ferdinand, in itself a beautiful painting, also reminds us of the sort of complexity of faith, portraiture, and certainty in the early modern Hispanic world. Thank you very much.